Good afternoon. My name is Shannon Boucher. I've been writing for some time under the pseudonym Shannon B. Douglas. You can find me at Shannon B. Douglas on Twitter. And I'm making a recording today about some issues happening in the gender wars in Canada and about some things that are coming up this September. And I'm both immensely optimistic about what's coming this fall and deeply frustrated and disappointed. Many of you may know that there's been a call for a 1,000,000-person march, and I'm going to circle back to that in a couple of minutes. But what I want to do first is I want to pay some homage. I want to give some respect, because this is not a new issue, but it is an issue that's coming to larger public consciousness and that is gathering momentum in terms of the pushback. And the homage I want to make is to the people who, long before I came along a couple of years ago into public criticism of gender ideology, particularly in education and in healthcare, and as it applies to children. That's my wheelhouse anyway. But people have been pushing back against this for a lot longer than I've been around. Some people come to mind, and I'm gonna miss people, and I beg your forgiveness, because so many incredible folks, a huge number of women, more so than men, which disappoints me. Megan Murphy stands out, and Amy Ham in Vancouver, Barry Neufeld, who was a school trustee in Chilliwack, BC, who took his case and his concerns about gender ideology to the Supreme Court, and who is still organizing and participating in public protests. He was a school trustee in Chilliwack who criticized SOGI, the sexual orientation and gender inclusion framework that was being brought into the public school system in British Columbia, teaching children that people can change sex and that there's a pathway to alleviate your gender dysphoria, which is through the medical system. Amy Ham and Chris Elston, better known as Billboard Chris, put up a billboard in Vancouver, I Heart J.K. Rowling, after J.K. Rowling became a public target for cancellation by the radical trans activists. There are people in British Columbia very, very active. The SOGI International Task Force, Pierre Barnes, who's been documenting the increasing incursion of sexually explicit materials into public school libraries, and has been raising awareness of that across the country. The writer Eva Korolova in Calgary, CAUSBAR, Canadian Women's Sex-Based Rights, women, both public and also in private, across the country, who have gathered together to express their concerns about gender ideology and how it affects the rights and safety of women. There are parents groups forming all over. There, in the last 9 months, a group of 1,000 or more parents in Prince Edward Island, which is an incredible number of people considering the population of PEI, since Premier Bill Higgs and Education Minister Hogan have pushed back against Policy 713 in New Brunswick. There's been an explosion in the number of parents who've come forward and organizing out there. I understand there's more than 1,000. There are parents and parents groups in school boards and school districts all over Ontario and all over the country. Durham region, I just saw the Facebook group today. There's over 500 people a part of that Facebook group. We know that Halton District, Parents came and organized to push back against the so-called inclusion of the large silicone-breasted shop teacher who couldn't be contained. And the people that I met when I ran for school board trustee last fall, not just all over Ontario, as we were kind of lumped into this idea of the anti-woke platform or the anti-trans platform. The Lighthouse Network. People who know the Lighthouse Network know that there are hundreds of members, that it is a incubator for activism, that the founder of Lighthouse has been facilitating people's growth and engagement in various areas to push back against the anti-racism movement, the critical theory movement, and the queer theory and gender in education. An incredible number of people with bravery, courage. What Peter Boghossian, the philosophy professor, formerly of Portland State University, reminds us is called paresthesia, an incapacity to not speak, a compulsion to say the truth. And all across Canada, this has been bubbling, and small groups of people have been coming together, and those groups have been inspiring other groups or growing themselves. Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism is another organization that has chapters in Canada now. Our Duty Canada, Women's Declaration International, LGB Alliance, Gays Against Groomers. So many courageous people. And there's been talk, and I'm proud to have been part of that conversation so far, about creating a coalition of those groups and those leaders from across the country, not to create a meta group specifically, but to be able to communicate effectively, leveraging the bases that we've been each individually and as groups been able to develop in the last several years, to be able to demonstrate to politicians and the media that we are a growing force, and that even though we have deep disagreements, Action for Canada, a Christian organization, has more than 100 chapters across the country, and a growing Muslim pushback on this issue, but nevertheless in common share these deep concerns for our children and for the direction that our education system is going, and the state of our society. So I want to talk a little bit about the 1,000,000-person march. And I want to say it's a month ago now, a number of different organizations, and like I said, I was going to forget, but there's a couple of organizations that have a good foothold in Canada. GenSpect is one of them, incredibly important organization pushing back against gender ideology. We have people from PIT, Parents with Inconvenient Truth About Trans, that are writing and collaborating in Canada. The Canadian Gender Report, Pamela Buffoni, who founded that organization some years ago after her daughter was taught that boys can become girls and girls can become boys in grade 1. Okay, and there are underground networks and Slack channels and Discord servers and all kinds of people who are working behind the scenes. And as most of you will recall, Billboard Chris Elson came back to Ottawa, to the site where he and I and Chanel Fall were mobbed in October of 2021 by about 300 people. And those people were whipped up by elected officials, school board officials, the Ottawa Carleton District School Board, member of Provincial Parliament Joel Harden, an aspiring mayor, Catherine McKenney, and other activists rallied about 300 borderline violent and aggressive rainbow protesters to silence us and intimidate us on a public street for expressing concerns about gender ideology in schools and children's capacity to consent to sex changes. Now Chris came back with young Josh Alexander and to Ottawa on the 9th of June of this year. And that catalyzed a discussion that had been going on for some months about creating a national coalition to be able to issue statements around specific issues and make comment and leverage the bases and the networks that we have to convey just how important this is to many, many Canadians, parents, loving siblings, gays and lesbians who are affected by radical trans ideology. And in June, well, actually it was the beginning of May, I made a public call to keep kids home from school following the Supreme Court decision about Barry Neufeld. And the Supreme Court of Canada, as you may or may not know, legitimized the public abuse of Barry Neufeld, the name calling, the vitriol, the character assassination, and the slander and libel by the head of the BC Teachers Federation, under the premise that gender non-conforming kids are the most historically oppressed minority, and that speech to be able to criticize. I mean, the perspective is completely upside down, and not only my heart broke, but my rage became uncontainable, and I recorded a call to action to keep kids home from school on June the 9th in solidarity with Chris Elston and Josh Alexander across the country, and other people had the same idea. I'm not suggesting that I'm some kind of maverick or leader or anything like that, because other people had the same idea. And some weeks ago, a U.S. organizer reached out to people in Canada through networks that exist to invite Canadians to participate in an International Day of School Absence on September the 14th, which is coming up fast. And at the same time in Ottawa, Muslims came out to protest, partly in solidarity with Chris Elston and Billboard Chris, and partly because the radical pride activism was being pushed so hard in schools that Muslims were keeping their kids home from elementary schools because it deeply conflicts with their religious values. And an organizer came out of that by the name of Camille Al-Sheikh. And Camille has made a call for a 1,000,000-person march and a national coalition. And I and others are beginning to have grave concerns about Camille's behavior and his willingness to actually collaborate with other people, and about his respect and complete lack thereof, to be quite frank, for the incredible people that have put in years of work on this issue, many times at great personal risk to their employability, their public reputation, their social status, and many of their relationships. Because this is such a contentious issue, and because trans rights activists, even unto violence, come after people who they perceive as threats to the imposition of their ideology. So Camille Al-Sheikh has been banging your drum about a 1,000,000-person march, and a couple of weeks ago, I was in a conference call with him and some leaders from other groups in Canada, and he's very controlling. He's a CEO of a company, and almost militant in his demands for people to comply to his vision of the world. And we pushed him to set a date, and we put forward the date of September the 14th to act in concert and in collaboration with the organizers from the United States. And he and others dismissed the 14th as a date, and nevertheless we got him to commit. Billboard Chris is in Toronto on the 22nd of September, the Friday. We suggested that date as well in solidarity with Billboard Chris, and that was shot down for a number of reasons. And and we settled on the 20th of September. Now, what's becoming apparent is that Camille Al-Sheikh is viewing himself as a leader of this movement, but Camille has only showed up in the last couple of months, has no history with this issue, and has unfortunately little credibility in terms of the time and energy and effort he's put in. And nevertheless, he is demanding that people comply with him. Now, some of the marketing and promotion of this event that's come out has said, don't believe the imposters, and ignore the people who are, like imitators. And he's come out with a video after a bunch of us were cut out from the online channels where we were helping to organize and contribute to this with our networks and our organizations, and he's condemning people for trying to take away from the efforts, and it's a very sad lack of understanding that he is demonstrating about the amount of energy, time, and passion that people have put into this across the country, the deep concern that people have, and a failure to recognize that people from coast to coast are deeply frustrated with this and looking for a moment, someone or some groups to put a flag in the ground and say, this is the day, and to gather around that flag together, regardless of our differences, whether we're Christians or Muslims or radical feminists or men's rights advocates and campaigners, whether we're loving moms or loving dads or gays or lesbians. And he is attempting to seemingly wrangle all of this under his empire of influence. And it's saddening and disturbing. And if Camille can bring the Muslim community together in protests across the country and rally that group of people, I want to extend to him all of the power and all of the respect that deserves. And he has to recognize, because he's criticizing people. Let me give you an example. In Windsor that week in September, on the night of the 19th, organized groups of parents, Christians and Muslims, that have nothing to do with Camille Al-Sheikh are already planning protests against the Windsor School Board, because the Windsor School Board locked parents out and shut down their meetings to the public, which is, at least as far as I can understand, against the law. They're not the only school board that's not listening to parents, but they have simply closed the doors and said that they're not allowing people to participate in the democratic process, and they're not going to hear the concerns that parents have. They're going to dictate their policies. And so organized groups are protesting that night on September the 19th. And the next day, because Camille and our group set the date, our group consisting of leaders of other groups who are concerned about this in schools, set a date of September the 20th, the Windsor parents and the coalitions that they're building, parentsrights.ca, Parents for Parents' Rights, and other groups are planning to protest like they did on June the 9th in solidarity with Billboard Chris, and they're going to engage with the public. Camille has condemned this because it's not in line with what he wants. He wants people to assemble at 9 o'clock on the morning of the 20th and march, and he's got a whole list of criteria, not recognizing that the people across the country with so many different views and perspectives are going to do their own thing, and that's good. And if we all do it on the same day, that's even better. But Camille doesn't own this movement. He doesn't control this movement. He doesn't speak for this movement. He doesn't speak for me. Now, on the 21st, there are events. And I'll be going to Windsor in solidarity and to support my friend Elton Robinson, who's leading Parents for Parents' Rights, and we're going to speak. And I believe that Pierre Barnes is going to be there from British Columbia. And the next day we're going to Toronto for the 22nd, because Billboard Chris and Josh Alexander are protesting there. And on the 23rd, Heather Mason, who is a founding member of Canadian Women's Sex-Based Rights and the lead campaigner for no males in women's jails, if I can borrow one of her slogans, raising awareness about frankly the absurdity of putting people with penises on self-declaration, men, criminals, sex offenders, into women's prisons in Canada. That's just in Windsor, and a little bit in Toronto about what's happening that week in Canada. The groups in British Columbia, SOGI International Task Force, Ronnie Herman with RH Media. I'm going to miss people. Barry Neufeld and others. They're holding protests almost daily sometimes. Amit Bering, please forgive me, Amrit Bering, who has founded another political party, I think it's called the Freedom Party in British Columbia, and others have been organizing signs on overpasses, and they're going to be doing their thing in September. This is only ramping up. So at this point, I'm deeply concerned about what one individual is doing to try and control everything that's happening, and not only control, but what I'm starting to perceive and others are perceive is to take credit. Now, I don't care if I'm a nobody. I don't care if history forgets me. I don't care if I get punted from all my social media. I have no interest. Actually, I would much rather I didn't have to stand up and take a public stake and take a public stand on this issue. I would much rather have my family together. I would much rather have my daughter and my son in my life, because they haven't been alienated from me by a cult. I would trade everything. It saddens me that a person, for whatever reason, seemingly wants to step up and claim ownership and claim to be a spokesperson for all of these groups across Canada, because he is not. Now, let me tell you what I think a coalition looks like. During the truckers' convoy, when Andrew Scheer, someone white, I think that's the right one, was basically, he lost his leadership. Candice Bergen stood up, and she took the interim leadership of the Conservative Party. Now, one of the conditions of that, as the party reformed around Pierre Poilievre, and in the time in between, was that she couldn't run for leadership. That when it was done, she would go back to being an MP. And I think that is what it's going to take to form a coalition, that a facilitator needs to step forward to help build a consensus group around a couple of key principles, the things that we share in common, regardless of all our differences, that we can all sign on to. And I've talked about this with leaders and executives from different groups across the country since last year. This is not a new idea for people. That we bring together a member of the executive from each of those groups in Canada that's been doing tremendous work for years on this issue, to come to the table in spite of our differences, and to empower a communications person and spokesperson who's not the president, who's not the leader, they're just a spokesperson, to convey the core principles, concerns, and objectives, and the demands of a coalition of groups of Canadians. Put aside our differences. And then, if necessary, we elect a president, secretary, and treasurer, but really, the important work is being done at the group level. Action for Canada is doing incredible work. Canadian Women's Sex-Based Rights is doing incredible work. Gays Against Groomer Canada, LGB Alliance Canada, Lighthouse Network, FAIR. All these groups need to continue the work that they're doing. This is not to take away anything from the work and from the core values and beliefs of any of those groups. It's to bring them together in common cause and common purpose. maybe there's a facilitator to bring that together and step away, because I want to go back to my life. I need to run a business. I've given this 2 years, and I would not leave it completely, but I can't do this full time anymore. And we need to come together respectfully and honoring the work and incredible sacrifice that so many people have made. And it saddens me that a person who seemingly is doing this with an idea of control and ego and dominance and telling people who's doing it right and who's not doing it right, I feel it is such an insult to so many great Canadians. My name is Shannon Boucher, Shannon B. Douglas on Twitter. For most of this year, up until the end of June, I was writing the weekly Canadian Gender Wars report for Woke Watch Canada, another incredible organization that's raising awareness about wokeness, about social justice activism, about the three big lies that exist in Canadian society right now. The big lie of transgenderism and trans activism, the big lie of colonialism and the lie of residential school mass graves, and the big lie of critical race theory that Canada is systemically racist against Black people. Those are lies, but those lies have become institutionalized, and anyone who questions them runs the risk of losing their livelihood. I look forward to September. I'm very optimistic. I can tell you that, and I won't tell you who, but a Conservative member of Parliament has reached out to group leaders and people contributing to this effort across the country. I know at least half a dozen people who've already talked to that person. I'm scheduled to talk to them in a couple of days. They're seeking the different perspectives and concerns that Canadians have, and the people who have founded and led those groups and those efforts have, because it's rising in the awareness of Conservative politicians. And we can look to the UK and we can look to states in the US to see that not just Conservatives, traditional Conservatives, but even the Labour Party in the UK has now backtracked on trans ideology and their position on self-identification and a bunch of other things. So this is coming down very quickly, and I'm optimistic. The gender bubble has burst. Like a stock market bubble, it's collapsing in on itself, and with that, I believe it will take down the edifice of social justice ideology and social justice activism. And I have hopes for the future that I hope you share with me. And I hope you'll participate in September. Here's the reason why I believe we have to keep our kids home. Because school boards and woke activists in positions of power have been empowered to abuse people who criticize them, even unto destroying their reputations and slander. The Supreme Court said it's okay. And we have to send our kids to school in Canada. But if we can coordinate and collaborate across the country to show just how many parents have concerns about this and keep kids home from school en masse, we demonstrate our concern. It's like voting by not participating. It's a passive resistance and a peaceful resistance method to communicate with politicians and existing leaders that this has to stop. It has to change. And I believe if you go to my website, Parents' Rights DOA, Day of Action, .ca, that at some point this may lead to a national parents' union lobbying for parents' rights, and lobbying in each province where education takes place for the rights of parents to raise their children according to their sacred values, and that we return schools to teaching math, reading, science, and and competence and skills for the future. I'll leave it here. I'm very proud to know so many great Canadians with integrity and commitment and courage that I've met in the last couple of years. And I hope that you'll participate in events in September this year.